27th, 1995, Baltimore, Maryland. It's early afternoon when a cable TV technician goes to the home of a new customer.
When the cable technician showed up, the door was open. She let herself in. And she wished that she hadn't. She saw that there was a man on the couch inside the apartment who was slumped over. She feared that he was dead. There was blood everywhere, on the walls, on his body.
The technician rushes to call 911.
And shortly thereafter, the EMTs and police showed up to the scene. It was immediately clear to EMTs that this victim had suffered severe injuries which ended his life. His head had been brutally smashed in with blood and brain matter everywhere. They actually couldn't tell if the damage was as a result of blunt force trauma or a gunshot wound.
When the police enter the apartment, they're able to do a quick scan and they find his wallet. And with that, they were able to confirm that the victim was in fact Leroy Lincoln Sr.
Leroy Lincoln Sr. was born in Baltimore, Maryland.
He was raised on Holland Street, which is in South Baltimore, known as Pigtown. He did have 2 other brothers, and he had 2 other sisters. He had somewhat of a strict background as well. His mother was a Jehovah's Witness, and she did her best to bring up her kids as witnesses as well. Some of them stayed with the religion, and some of them strayed with it. My father was one that was kind of like 1 foot in, 1 foot out.
Leroy was known as someone who was fun. He was fun-loving, he laughed, he played, he joked. The people who knew Leroy and spent time with him really enjoyed being around him.
In the 1960s, Leroy's easygoing charm and quick wit caught the attention of a woman named Geraldine Parks.
My mother, she's from Trap Hill, North Carolina. She is also one of a large family. She was raised in the country where you're waking up with roosters crowing. Totally different than my father's background. He was born in the city.
Geraldine had been married as a teenager, but that relationship ended shortly after the birth of her daughter. When she met Leroy on a trip to Baltimore, she saw a chance to make a fresh start.
She wanted to be free. She wanted to experience life. At the time, she did have 1 child, but she just wanted to get away. And my father kind of represented an exciting life in Baltimore. My mother told me that she loved the way my father made her laugh. He was a natural comedian, and she was looking for a good laugh, someone that could make her feel a certain way, and he fulfilled that. So she moved to Baltimore to be with him. But she found out she was also pregnant by him, which led to my other sister being born.
Over the next decade, Leroy and Geraldine's family continued to grow.
I have 2 older sisters, then it's me, and then I have 2 younger sisters and 2 younger brothers.
Leroy and Geraldine, they had the American dream. Everything was good for them. They built a life together, with Leroy having a job at the MTA and Geraldine being at home with the kids.
Leroy continued to stray from some of the teachings of his Jehovah's Witness faith. And at first, Geraldine was all for it.
They used to be the party house, how much fun they used to have. Everybody from the neighborhood would be there. They used to have a great time.
There was always alcohol flowing, weed in the background. This was back in the 70s. It was just live. We had the party house.
Then, in the late 70s, the Lincoln family suffered a tragedy that would change all of their lives.
When Geraldine gave birth to their 7th child, the child was born, stillborn, and that really devastated her.
My mother went into this deep depression. She saw no way out. My father's mother pulled my mother to the side and told her, you know, you're going to see him again one day. You know, and she started telling her about the promise of a new order, the promise of a resurrection. once you turn your life over to Jehovah, your loved ones will be brought back to life. And my mother held fast to that deeply. She started going to the hall, started dedicating her life to Jehovah, becoming a Jehovah's Witness. And she gave my father the ultimatum: this is what you're gonna have to do, otherwise we can't be together. And my father loved her, he wanted to be with her. My father kind of got back into it, and they realized that they felt like they were living in sin. So they both got baptized and they got married and started living their lives as Jehovah's Witnesses.
Her dad was more of the laid-back kind of guy. I think he didn't really care so much about the faith. But for her mom, it was everything. And it ruled their household. Can't do this, you can't do that. You can't associate with this person or that one.
We went from being a party house to every Sundays, every Tuesdays, every Thursdays, we in the Kingdom Hall. We couldn't drink no more. You can't be around people that's smoking no more.
This was a challenge for Leroy. He was doing this for her, and he wasn't quite ready to adjust at the speed that she was.
Things started becoming challenging. My father wasn't having that no more. He was not having it anymore. My father had a problem with smoking cigarettes. He couldn't stop smoking. So they kicked him out of the hall because of that. You know, they kicked him out of the religion.
While smoking was prohibited, divorce was also forbidden. So Geraldine tried to keep the marriage going, but still followed the religion's rules of disfellowshipped former members.
When you're disfellowshipped in the Jehovah's Witness congregation, you're basically shunned. Nobody can talk to you. If they talk to you, then they're going to be shunned as well. My mother couldn't speak to him no more. We as kids couldn't even speak to him anymore. He living in the same house. We can't say, "Hi, Daddy, what you want for breakfast?" None of that.
I think he just felt alienated. He did feel like a stranger in his own house.
I can imagine that must have sent him into a really, really dark place, which wouldn't have helped his addiction to alcohol and cigarettes.
According to his loved ones, Leroy turned to other vices as well.
He was unable to get his needs met, intimacy, closeness, all of those things were removed from him. And so he started to seek for those things elsewhere. Leroy was in and out of different relationships with other women, cheating. He would leave the house and eventually come back.
I think it took Geraldine so long to consider divorces because it is a huge sin in most faiths and most religions to get a divorce. I think that was probably her last resort.
In January 1995, the couple realized they've had enough, despite Geraldine's faith. She kept their children and their home, and Leroy moved into an apartment.
I think Tia's dad wanted his family. You know, it seems like he was a good father. I always felt that he still tried to maintain relationships with his kids.
Now, 1 month after he moved out, Leroy is dead at just 51 years old. And Baltimore police want to know why, and if his lifestyle had something to do with it.
Once my father left the Jehovah's Witness religion, he started doing his own thing. He got another girlfriend. He got with friends who did drugs. He started smoking weed. That weed led to other drugs. Jehovah's Witnesses will call it the wrong crowd. And they will say that he started hanging with people who, well, there was a scripture, 1 Corinthians 15:33. Basically, that was drilled in our heads that bad associations spoil useful habits.
"51-year-old Leroy Lincoln Sr. has been found murdered in his apartment, and authorities are looking for clues. The damage to his skull is so severe, they can't even tell yet if he was shot or beaten to death."
Because the victim's wallet and cash were still there and there were no signs of forced entry, detectives ruled out burglary as a possible motive for the murder.
And there was no murder weapon at the scene. They didn't find any fingerprints, they didn't find any DNA, everything was spotless.
Detectives do find something else, however.
There was drug paraphernalia that was found in the home. There was crack cocaine.
They find a pipe and they also find a partially smoked joint.
The police went around to ask questions of the neighbors, but he lived in the hood in Baltimore, so nobody saw anything.
That's not uncommon for people to really not want to get involved or say anything to the police. However, one neighbor does recall hearing some strange things the night before. It sounded like someone was knocking on Leroy's door late the other night. Shortly after he heard the knocking, he heard the TV come on, and then he heard some type of commotion happening. At the time, he didn't think much of it. He thought maybe Leroy's just a night owl, but now he's having thoughts of whether or not he heard the murder.
Unfortunately, Leroy's neighbor couldn't provide any useful details. To investigators, the drug paraphernalia suggests a scenario that's become all too common in the area.
In the 1990s, Baltimore was really known for high crime rates. In fact, it was higher than the national average. Baltimore was averaging about 300 murders a year in the 90s.
Many of the crimes were shootings, fueled by a cycle of revenge.
They were drug shootings. You sold on my turf. You killed my brother. You killed someone in my family. You stole my drug pipeline. It's a never ending in that manner until we find a way to solve the drug problem.
Leroy's murder is the 44th in Baltimore that year, and it's only the end of February. His daughter, Tia, learns about it that evening.
I was doing laundry, watching the news like I always do. The headline of the news was there was a homicide in East Northern Parkway. They said the victim was a former MTA bus driver. I was like, what? So I stopped what I was doing and I called my father's phone. No answer, no answer, no answer. I'm blowing it up, no answer.
When someone does finally answer Leroy's phone, it's a homicide detective.
And I said, look, is my father there? Is my father there? What is going on? He said that my father was killed. I lost it. I fell to the floor, I screamed, I cried, and all of that. When I got myself together, I asked him, I said, are you sure, was this like a mistake? I said, look, my father had no enemies. He was a jokester. He don't go around robbing drug dealers. He don't go around beating people up. I was just trying to digest the fact that he had just been murdered. I didn't immediately think that it was anybody. I was just like, who would do it?
Investigators are asking the same question. And now that they are in contact with family, they speak with more loved ones. They begin with Geraldine.
She denied actually being there or obviously laying a finger on him.
She swore that she had nothing to do with his murder and that she was home with her daughter that night.
However, she admits she's never forgiven Leroy for his shortcomings.
She let detectives know that they were going through a divorce and that he had cheated on her multiple times and that they were not in a good place with each other. Geraldine disclosed to police that Leroy had been smoking crack for years and that this was one of the key points that caused their separation. She wouldn't be surprised that some of the drug connections that he has is probably the cause of his murder. She claimed that it was possible that one of the women that he had cheated with was responsible, or one of the boyfriends or husbands of those women could have been responsible for his murder. The police also speak to the couple's 18-year-old son, who was still living at the house with his mother. Leroy Lincoln Jr. confirms the story about his father's drug addiction. He also has an alibi for the night of the murder.
Authorities hope the autopsy will reveal a fresh avenue of investigation.
The medical examiner's autopsy report sheds a little more light on the case. They determined that the cause of death was blunt force trauma. The beating was so severe that it had shattered Leroy's skull into pieces. Whoever killed him seemed to take out a lot of pent-up rage. Given the past stories of drug problems with Leroy Lincoln Sr., it is not out of the question that someone who he had been involved with in that life is responsible for his murder. Unfortunately, investigators have no suspects in the case.
Tia worries her father's murder will become another unsolved case in a city overwhelmed with violent crime.
To be honest with you, in the city of Baltimore, you lose a family member, that's it. Investigations, 50% of them are not even solved. I was expected to just pick up and just move forward and live my life. But after he was killed, we had to plan a funeral.
Leroy was quite a beloved member of his community and was very well liked by many people around the city. But people noticed that not everyone is upset about his murder.
When friends and loved ones gather at the funeral of Leroy Lincoln Sr., it quickly becomes clear that Leroy's widow, Geraldine, still bears a grudge.
My mother insisted that that casket stay open. She wanted everybody to see what had happened to him. The funeral director said the only way we can do this open casket, somebody got to buy him a hat or something because there's no head here. So my fiance went to the store and bought him a skull cap.
The funeral home actually has to ask a pastor who was there for another funeral to come over and lead the celebration for Leroy's life.
But my mother deliberately told the officiant that she didn't want anybody to speak over him. She didn't want anybody to say anything nice about him. I was sitting there in tears like, this is really going down like this? After the viewing, my mother decided that my father was going to be cremated as soon as possible. She didn't want a tombstone or anything like that. She didn't care what they did with his ashes. She told them to flush him down the toilet. To this day, I don't know where they are. My father doesn't have a tombstone. Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe in going to grave sites like that anyway, but I always wanted that to do, at least for Father's Day or birthday or something, but nothing. I kind of do regret not speaking up on requesting his ashes because he deserved better than that.
To Tia Lincoln, her mother's behavior isn't just strange, it's suspicious.
I had a nagging feeling that something wasn't right, but I was trying to swallow that away, trying to ignore it.
But Geraldine's actions are difficult to ignore.
About a week after Leroy Sr.'s murder, Geraldine moves back to North Carolina with her daughter and her son, Leroy Jr. This is odd because she had just moved into the home about a month ago.
Her lease wasn't up or anything, and she just left so quickly after he was murdered. Why did that happen?
As the months pass, Tia is increasingly bothered by her mother's actions and inaction.
Why did you not ever call the police to try to investigate to figure out what happened to him? I understand y'all were going through a divorce, but damn, nothing? She never did any of that?
Unfortunately, Tia seems to be the only member of the family still interested in pursuing the case, and detectives are unable to find any proof of her suspicions.
There was no forensic evidence developed in this case. DNA only occurs mainly if someone spits on you or has sex with you. This is not the type of case.
It was a low probability of the case ever being solved. After about a year, the police department shelved the case, and eventually it was considered an unsolved murder, then transitioned into a cold case.
That pissed me off, and that's when I was just like, look, something got to be done. Otherwise, I can't move on with my life.
She was really very sad and heartbroken about her father's death. It wasn't as a thing where you could see her going in the corner and crying. It was more like, yo, I want to know what happened to my dad.
She didn't want to accept what police had to say, and she was really frustrated with Baltimore police.
I had to figure out what had happened to my father. So after I got myself together and I started playing things in my head, I wanted the detectives to conduct a thorough investigation, and that means questioning everybody in his family, including my mother, Geraldine.
When the anniversary of Leroy Lincoln Sr.'s murder passes without any new leads, his daughter, Tia Lincoln, decides to act.
After it seemed like nothing was being done, a year later, I started to investigate the case on my own. I didn't have money to hire an investigator. I started talking to his friends, trying to see if he had any enemies. I started talking to his former girlfriends to see if they had any hidden agendas or vendettas against him or anything like that. Everything just kept leading back to a feeling that I kept trying to swallow, kept trying to ignore. It just kept coming back to mama, maybe she had something to do with it.
The first red flag was Geraldine's handling of Leroy's funeral and her abrupt move back to North Carolina. The second comes when she returns to collect his insurance money.
When my father was killed, even though they were going through a nasty, bitter divorce, she was still technically the beneficiary on his life insurance policies. She broke her neck to come up here to get his life insurance because the checks came to my house, but she wouldn't come up here for any other reason. That seemed suspicious. I think their total, they only came up to about $60,000. And she was like, where's the rest? Where's the rest? She was extremely pissed off about that. What happened was, we didn't find this out till later, he had stopped paying on it, so he had canceled that particular policy.
Geraldine also cautions Tia to stop bothering the police with her inquiries into Leroy Sr.'s murder. She says that Leroy was a dirtbag and deserved to get whatever he got.
I think her mom's hostility and this resentment that never showing sympathy or remorse about what happened to him, it created a bigger suspicion.
That suspicion ultimately unlocks a crucial memory Tia first thought was a joke.
We were raised to believe that Daddy does not care about us. Daddy cares about his drugs more than he cares about us. He cares about his other girlfriends more than he cares about us. So we grew up with huge animosity towards him. My mother would always constantly, these weren't jokes. You know, I just wish somebody would take him out.
She remembered hearing her mother say that she wished that someone would kill Leroy Sr.
My father only had one person that hated him, hated his entire being, and that was my mother.
Tia summons the strength to confront her mother.
I flat out asked her, did you have anything to do with it? And of course she denied it. She said no, and she was really insistent this time, look, get over it, stop asking me that, move on.
Tia doesn't give up, but instead digs deeper. She doesn't think her mother would beat Leroy Sr. to death on her own.
I thought that if she was involved, who would she get to do her killing? One of the people that she would have had to recruit to do this would have had to have been my brother Leroy Jr. And the reason why I say that is because they were close. I was going off of a hunch. I didn't know for sure.
A hunch isn't enough for Baltimore investigators to act on, and years continue to pass with no movement on the case.
After 7 years, I finally came up with a plan to get the detectives to, at the very least, question somebody.
She got to a place of desperation where she didn't see any way out, and she needed answers. So she decided to do the only thing that she thought she could do.
I knew that at the time that my brother had a girlfriend who had a drug problem. And I also knew that she had been in and out of jail. So I was gonna play like I was her. So I went to a payphone, I called the detectives, disguised my voice, and told them that I had information about an unsolved homicide. They were like, well, what information do you want to provide? And I said, my boyfriend did it. I said, he came in the house and he said he killed his father. He had blood on his clothes. I said that, you know, I was dying of AIDS. I wanted to clear my conscience. I didn't leave a name though.
That was a huge, huge risk. But it did pay off. It forced the police department to take her father's case seriously. Had Tia not made that call, she would have never found out what happened to her dad.
Acting on Tia Lincoln's false tip about the murder of her father, Leroy Lincoln Sr., authorities tracked down Leroy Jr.'s former girlfriend.
Detectives go right over there, but she seems surprised to see them. She says that she never made that call, but the details of the call are actually true. She tells police that she did overhear a conversation between her then boyfriend, Leroy Jr., and his mother, Geraldine Lincoln. They were discussing having Leroy Sr. murdered.
The girlfriend's story about the night Leroy Sr. was killed actually matches a detail Tia had made up when she called investigators, and reveals a third conspirator.
She said that my brother came in the house with blood on his clothes and confessed to killing his father with his friend John.
Leroy Jr., he had a best friend named John Cross, who he grew up with, and John came with a pretty lengthy criminal record himself. So it makes sense that if Leroy was going to do something like this, he would definitely bring someone like John along with him.
For the first time in 7 years, Baltimore police have a solid lead. They ask North Carolina police to pick up Geraldine Lincoln and her son Leroy Jr. and hold them for questioning. And locally, they begin searching for Leroy Jr.'s alleged accomplice.
He was serving time away on a burglary charge. They went to his cell and everything, and they questioned him about a murder. He was like, I don't know none of them. I don't know nothing about anything.
After getting nothing from John Cross, detectives traveled to North Carolina to interview Geraldine and Leroy Jr.
When they accuse her of being the mastermind behind her husband's murder, she denies having anything to do with it. What she does say is that it doesn't matter who killed her husband because he deserved it.
The detective said she went into a 6-minute rant of how bad he was. You know, he was this, he was that, he was disgusting, he was blah, blah, blah.
The way Geraldine Lincoln described her husband was not pleasant. I believe he used drugs. He may have used drugs in the presence of his children. I do know there are allegations that he molested his daughters.
According to Geraldine, what happened to him was payback for all of the pain that he inflicted on others.
But who delivered that payback? Investigators turn up the pressure by showing Geraldine 3 incriminating photos.
The first is a photo of Leroy Jr. The caption reads, "That's Junior, whose father he and I killed for Miss Geraldine." It's signed John Cross. The second photo is of John Cross, and this one too has a caption. This is John. Junior said he hit Junior's father over the head while they smoked weed. This photo seemed to be signed by Junior's girlfriend. The third photo is of Geraldine, and on the back of this photo it says, "This is Miss Geraldine. She set up the murder of Junior's dad." It was dated the same date as the photos that were signed by John Cross.
there was a little bit of deception because they were not written by the actual witnesses or suspects. They were written by the detective. That said, what they wrote were facts that were already proven by the investigation so far.
The ruse works. After years of denial, Geraldine finally breaks.
When confronted with those photos, Geraldine Lincoln eventually admitted that she wanted her husband, decedent Leroy Lincoln Sr., murdered, and admitted a degree of participation in that she wanted him dead.
She's like, yeah, I knew about the murder. Yeah, I knew that they killed him. Yeah, they got the axe out of my house. She said, well, how is that a crime? What did I do wrong? Just because I didn't say anything? Just because I didn't stop them? And just because I talked about it for years and pumped their heads up to do it, I didn't do anything wrong.
She was charged with first-degree murder because she wanted it to happen, planned it, and solicited people to do it. She was also charged with conspiracy.
Investigators try the same approach with Leroy Jr., but he doesn't take the bait.
The game that the detectives played failed. Even after seeing the photos, he still denied that he had anything to do with his father's death. But then the investigators tried their last trick. They got a tape recorder and played parts of their interview with Leroy's mother. Those clips had been edited to make it sound like Geraldine had implicated her son in the murder of his father.
Once they played him that tape, he put his head on the table and was just like, all right, I'm gonna tell you everything you wanna know.
He claimed that he had been physically and psychologically abused by his father, and that his father would beat all of the children with extension cords and other things that he found around the house. Leroy Jr. even suggested that his father had forced him and his brother to sell crack cocaine. Leroy Jr. believed that his father had been trying to destroy their family for years, and that by February 1995, it was time for his father to pay for his evil deeds.
After helping his mother, Geraldine Lincoln, cover up the murder of his father for over 7 years, Leroy Lincoln Jr. is now ready to confess everything.
Leroy tells police that he, his mother, and John Cross had been plotting to kill his father for months. The night of the murder, Leroy Jr. said that he and John met at Geraldine's house. They got the handle from an axe that she had lying around, and they went over to Leroy Sr.'s house. When they got there, they knocked on the door, and Sr. let them in. They led him to believe that they were there to smoke marijuana and watch TV with him.
They were sitting there drinking and smoking one minute, and he said that he looked over at John. They made eye contact, and he said that John had acted like he was gonna go to the bathroom or something, and he could see out of the corner of his eye that John had the axe like this. And he said he hit my father with the axe.
Leroy Jr. says that after the murder was completed, that John sat his father's body back on the couch and they left. But obviously they hadn't closed the door on their way out. Leroy Jr. says that he dropped John off at his house before he went back to his own home, where he told his girlfriend what had happened.
Geraldine Lincoln, Leroy Lincoln Jr., and John Cross are all charged with first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit first-degree murder.
In late 2003, Leroy Jr. is the first to be tried in his father's murder. The prosecution's case is depending upon the testimony of his ex-girlfriend and his own taped confession. The defense team argues that Leroy Jr. never had anything to do with his father's murder and that his confession was coerced. They painted Leroy Sr. as an evil man who was addicted to drugs, who forced his children to sell drugs, and who was physically, mentally, and sometimes sexually abusive.
But But there is no evidence whatsoever to prove Leroy Sr. was abusive.
I'm just gonna say, look, he never touched me. He never acted like he wanted to touch me. I mean, he never looked at me like he wanted to touch me. But that rumor was spread throughout our family, and that was part of the reasons why we were groomed to hate him.
Tia takes the stand for the prosecution.
Tia Lincoln.
And do you have a brother named Leroy Lincoln?
Yes.
What, if anything, did defendant Leroy Lincoln Jr. say he wanted to do to his father, your father?
He didn't say, okay, I want to kill him. You know, it was more so of him being around, you know, when the conversations were being talked about, you know, as far as my mother, and I can't remember him specifically saying, okay, well, I want to kill him, you know.
The defense tries to pin the murder on Geraldine, arguing only she wanted Leroy Sr. dead.
How many times would you say altogether your mother brought up this same subject, wanting to get the father out of the way, be nice to get the money, get him out of my life, get it to myself, whatever she was saying? How many different times did that same tape come up?
Over 15.
Over 50 times?
Over 50.
On September 25th, 2003, the jury reaches a verdict.
They find Leroy Lincoln Jr. guilty of the conspiracy to commit murder, but they acquit him of the first-degree murder charge. He's sentenced to life in prison with all but 25 years suspended.
I mean, my brother, he had no remorse from it. He was not sorry for it. I even asked him that, are you sorry? Do you regret it? No, not at all.
A week later, Geraldine opts for a bench trial, which means she only faces a judge, not a jury.
She was charged with first-degree murder, even though she didn't lay a finger on the victim. I had to know, I had to dot all the I's, cross all the T's. I had to put on all those witnesses who heard them planning and talking about and wanting to kill Leroy Lincoln Sr. There's no direct evidence. No one saw her do it. No one said, please kill him, I'll pay you. But there was enough there to convict her of a conspiracy.
The court agrees. And on October 1st, 2003, Geraldine is found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy. Like her son, she receives a life sentence. But the 2004 trial for their alleged co-conspirator, John Cross, yields a much different result.
Unfortunately, he was found not guilty by a city jury in Baltimore.
John was acquitted because, again, he had an excellent attorney, and also there was no physical evidence linking him to that crime, and also without eyewitness testimony of one of the murderers that was there was no case. He walked. Haven't heard from him since.
It was a cold case, which already has a high degree of difficulty in steering convictions. I'm still unhappy with the fact that we did not bring Mr. Cross to justice.
After just 8 years in prison, Geraldine is released on parole. 2 years after that, Leroy Jr. is also released.
Revenge is never worth it. Both people suffer, the person who's killed and the person who killed them.
The fact that she would go to such an extent to get rid of someone just shows you how ugly hate can really be. You know, she would have been better served just letting him be a dad and moving on with her life and finding new happiness somewhere else. And instead, she impacted the lives of all of his children and his grandchildren that'll never know him.